So, yeah, let's get into it. So, what is a perennial? You know, somebody just asked me a really interesting question. Oh, something already fell down. And they said, where does the word perennial come from? And I never think to address that. Very simply, it's based in Latin. It comes from per, meaning through, and it comes from annus, meaning yes. Perennial, perennis means through the yes. So it's really that simple. And based on that, a perennial is a plant that lives 2 or more seasons. And it, you know, we use the term perennial because that distinguishes between an annual, which we talked about last week. The annual has its entire life cycle in one growing season, and the biennial, which has its entire life cycle in 2 growing seasons. And then the perennial is anything that comes back after 2 seasons of growing. Now, trees and shrubs are technically perennials based on the definition, even the Latin root word. They come back, they last through the years. But when we discuss perennial in a gardening context, we're mainly talking about herbaceous perennials. And I'll grab my rhubarb here because I love rhubarb. All herbaceous is that there's no heavy wooden stem, there's no branches. It's kind of that fleshy, succulent part makes up the body of the plant. Now, some really, really, really old mature perennials can actually start to develop a wooden base down here, but you're never going to see a full wooden stem. Daylilies, if ever you've deadheaded the daylily, but you've left the stem, those stems can almost turn into like a woody fiber. But we're not talking about a strong wood structure like maples, spruce trees, dogwoods, hydrangeas. We're talking about the herbaceous nature of these perennials. So that kind of, in a nutshell, is a perennial, because honestly, the number one question we get asked when it comes to this field is people come and they go, I'm not sure if I want an annual or a perennial, which one comes back every year? And it's tricky. Annual literally means, yeah, so you think, oh, that comes back every year. So that's why we always go over that. Half the people looking out because they're like, I'm in the wrong webinar. I wanted annuals, what the hell? So we'll talk about that life cycle. And I've got my notes here in case you hadn't realized when I started talking about the hoster, I digress, or I can digress pretty rapidly. So I basically print out the slideshow you guys are watching. I have my handy dandy watch on, and it kind of keeps me on track, because without this, you let me run, within 10 minutes, we'll be talking about kangaroos and I'll be Googling answers on them. I think we did one webinar where I said something about a kangaroo eating a tomato. Then I didn't know if kangaroos ate tomatoes. So then I had to find that out. They will indeed eat tomatoes if you are curious. See, even with note, straight off on a tangent. So a perennial life cycle, it starts like any plant does with germination. With perennials, that can also be propagation. Some people will take cuttings, some people will take root cuttings, some will grow from seed. The Aquilegia or the columbine, very popular to grow from seed. Lupins are really good. A lot of Astilbes, bleeding hearts will do great from root cuttings. Monkshood is one that you can propagate in water if you get a good enough section of it. So you can do all of that. But to keep it simple, and I'm very, very lazy, so I didn't want to write everything out. I'm just going to call it all germination. Then, after we have the germination, so that's right when the plant sprouts, it's put out some new leaves, it's put out new roots, however we got there. Now we do the vegetative growth cycle. So what that means is now we're going to plant it. With a perennial, we're going to put it outside in a greenhouse with what we do. Obviously, we put them in pots so you guys can get them home. And now it's going to put out the vegetative growth. So these have flowers because I can't help myself. They're pretty, so I grabbed them. A rhubarb, if you let it go, will indeed flower. Right now, this is putting out vegetative growth. It has new growth coming out. Get out of here, bud. So this is the cycle it's in now. It's spring, it's getting light, it's getting warmth, it's getting water, it's getting everything it needs. So it's going to push out that vegetative growth. The vegetative growth, after that, then comes the flowering, which we can see here. And basically the plant is going to grow, and we'll touch on this a bit later. Perennials will bloom, not all the same ones, but different perennials will bloom spring, summer, and autumn. Not like annuals where that same flower will bloom all through the season. Perennials have a specific time and a much shorter period of flowering, but they do indeed flower. And right now, the ones that aren't flowering are gathering the energy to put the flowers out. The early spring ones, they blast that energy out right away, and then the rest of the season, they soak the energy up, put it into their roots, so they're ready to rock and roll for next spring. After the vegetative cycle comes the seed development, and that's purely, again, for plant propagation. Pollinators, hummingbirds, bumblebees, pollinators, and I started with hummingbirds, because that's the first one in everybody's mind. Pollinators, such as bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds, would probably be a better order to do it, love perennials. Great source of nectar and pollen. And the great thing about them is as they mature, they put out a prolific amount of blooms. So they've always got something different and they can bounce around. So these are great, a great addition to the garden. Then after the seed development, again, if it's an early spring one, it does the seeds, then it sticks around, but then it finishes its life cycle by going into dormancy. And all that means is as the light goes away, it gets colder, the leaves aren't photosynthesizing anymore, nothing's happening. So the plant shuts everything down, goes to sleep. Hopefully it got enough energy, it got enough water, fertilizer, it's in a good spot. Hey presto, next spring, it starts it again. And that's what it does every year till it reaches the end of its life cycle. Then you may have to replace it, but a lot of perennials are very, very, very long lasting. You can start dividing, and we'll talk about dividing and transplanting and whatnot in our second webinar on perennials, but you can get decades out of them. So that's kind of what the life cycle is of a perennial. And some examples of perennials, a lot of times when we think perennials, and I'm guilty of this too, if somebody asks me for a perennial, I immediately go to ornamental. I immediately go to delphiniums and monks and hostas, peonies. That's what I love. That's instantly where my brain associates. But there are other ones. There's mint, there's chives, there's rhubarb, and then there's all of those flowers. There's clematis, there's climbing vines. So you can have an extremely, extremely diverse garden with perennials where things are going to bloom. There's ground cover. The ajuga is a great one, otherwise known as bugleweed. I don't know why they put weed at the end of the name. That's kind of throwing it under the bus. Like, I don't know why you have to shame it like that. Because weed literally means not wanted plant. Harsh. Come today and adopt a bugleweed. I feel like we should be playing Sarah McLachlan in the background. Yeah, there you go. All the bugleweeds are crying. Totally. All right. Bugleweeds are an amazing ground cover. They do great around a patio or a flagstone pathway. And then you've got plants all different heights, all the way up. Some hostas, they'll get a spread like this on them, like 2 foot, 2.5 foot, but they'll only get 2 foot tall. So you've got so much diversity in foliage coloration, in foliage size, leaf cut. Then you get into the blooms. So perennials are really the backbone of a garden. A lot of times people, they don't want to do perennials because once this one, and I'm going to try and use different ones here to showcase different perennials. This is a bleeding heart. So named because of its awesome flower that literally looks like a bleeding heart. And people love this one. Easy to identify, grows excellent in Calgary. They love the flower, but then when the flower's gone, now it's just a green shrub. And they go, well, I want flowers year round. And I dig that. I feel the same. And that's why you have to change it up. You know, we have a list of perennials, and in no way, shape, or form are any of my lists during these webinars, you know, the complete picture of it. A lot of them are just to cite examples. I try and use common ones that people have heard the name or they may have growing, so they can associate immediately. We've got well over 100 different varieties of perennials in our perennial department. And our perennial buyer, Barb, is always on the lookout for new ones and fun ones, fan favorites. Was it popular last year? Let's bring it in again, to really keep that excitement going. So we can do a lot with perennials. And another thing that people get, and I think it's because, you know, perennials, we know they're going to last for a long time. They, you know, plant to plant, you get a one plant annual, one plant perennial. Perennial is probably going to be more expensive, a little trickier to grow. It's going to last for a long time. There's a lot more invested in it. Just literally the size of the pot and the amount of soil in it, right there. So people often seem gun shy about planting their perennials. You know, they often ask, what do I need to know? So I just put together a couple of little points. And what you want to do when you're planting everything, I don't care if it's annuals, flowers, veggies, herbs, whatever, trees, shrubs, perennials, it doesn't matter. You always want to start with amending that soil. Soil, water, and light are the building blocks. For want of a better term, they're the meat and potatoes of the existence. Fertilizer and deadheading and maintenance and weeding and all of that comes after the fact. They really want a healthy soil because those roots are growing in it forever. So, and we'll touch on this again a little bit later. So every spring, if you have a perennial bed, a perennial border, even just a little grouping of perennials, always amend that soil. They're going to need it because every year to keep growing and get the strength to come back and then put out the prolific blooms. I mean, this to me is just gorgeous. The color, the shape, the symmetry. And if you look at how many flowers, and this isn't even a year old. This is two months. When did we start growing? February? Yeah. So this isn't even a full 2 months old, and it's already putting out that amount of flowers. That requires incredible amounts of energy, and it requires an incredible amount of nutrition to make it happen. And that's where our fertilizer and the organic material. So using a compost, worm castings, peat moss, coconut coir. You don't need them all. You can come in and talk to us. We can get through that. Some people have a preference. I prefer manure to compost. Great, fill your boots. As long as you're putting, don't fill your boots actually, because then it's all good. You put your boot on, it's full of compost. That's no good. Fill your beds. Put your flower beds, not your bed. Otherwise, then you're going to sleep in compost. See where I go with this? But you want to make sure that you've got lots of organic, healthy material in the soil to replenish those minerals that the plants are naturally going to deplete by growing. And the other great thing about amending the soil, especially in the early spring, is that you've loosened it. So when you're trying to get your shovel in, and I grabbed this one, this is great if you're planting in a perennial bed. It's nice and small, so you run the risk of damaging existing roots. It fits a pot really well, slightly bigger, so if I dig that out, I've still got enough room to get soil in, because sometimes when we're doing perennials, maybe a perennial hasn't formed very well. Maybe it got hit by bugs at the end of its lifespan, and you want to replace it like to like. So your delphinium didn't make it, whatever the reason, but you love delphiniums, no problem. You lift out the old one, but this delphinium has got echinacea around it, and it's got black-eyed Susan, it's got bugleweed, and so you can't go, like, you know, you don't have this massive piece of lawn to dig this huge hole. You have to dig really tight, otherwise you're going to hurt the roots of your other perennials. So when you amend the soil, you're breaking up all of that compaction that we got from the winter, from the snow and the ice, maybe the dog walking on it, maybe us walking on it. And you add that rich, beautiful new compost manure to feed them. So when you do it, dig the hole slightly bigger than the pot. If you've got enough room to do this, go for it. No problem. And then what you want to do is you want to take the perennial. I'm not going to do it because these are young. Loosen the pot, brace the crown, flip it, give a squeeze, take your perennial out. That easy. You know, I'm always popping plants out of pots. Like I said, some of these guys are literally not that old. So we have to be very, very gentle with them. And then you'll see one of the points there in how to plant a perennial is place in the hole at ground level. So we'll use our delphinium because it's right there. You only have enough room to dig this wide. That's fine. I can still get my hand around it to backfill. So the soil, that good amended soil, and the existing soil, I want that in there as well. And I put that all around it, and it's firmed in. But I want the soil here in this pot to match the soil of the garden it's going in. I don't want to plant it too deep, and I don't want roots exposed. Neither of those are great. If you hit a tree root or a rock, ideally you want to move your perennial. If you have to plant it a little high, you can. I don't like it. Mulch it. Get those roots covered somehow. Mound soil up. Do whatever you can to protect those roots. And those are stopgaps. I do not recommend that. I recommend planting at the correct depth. So you want to do that. And then backfill with soil. So a common mistake people make is they try to do too much for their plant. They'll get a compost or a potting soil or a garden soil, and they'll go, oh, this is the best stuff. Not wrong at all. It is amazing. So they'll backfill exclusively with that around the plant. Now what happens is these roots, let's grab a different plant. We're using you too much. We'll grab the yellow columbine. So these roots have been growing in a very porous, peat-based growing medium, growing mix. And the reason for that is because when those baby roots start, they don't have the strength to go into a really heavy soil. Plus, they're in a pot. We want to make sure there's adequate drainage. We don't want root rot. So this soil, it's amazing for growing. Then we put it outside and we add a soil like that. Well, those roots, they're growing along and they hit that new soil and they're like, oh, this is easy. Life is gravy. Then they hit our heavy Calgary clay soil. And suddenly they're like, what am I up against here? They've never developed that strength. And plants like a bit of adversity. We baby them, we fertilize them, and we prune and we deadhead and we clean dog hairs off them. And we do all of that, but they like to be challenged. They don't want, and we'll talk about this when we do trees. Common mistake people get is they put in a new tree and they water it every single day forever. Well, those roots have no reason to go deep. Everything they need is on the surface. Then we get a big windstorm or a snowstorm and the tree falls over because the roots haven't anchored it. Where you stop watering it, those roots go, oh no, we need to find our own water, and they go down. Same with this. So the soil you dig out of the hole, mix that 50-50 is the blend I use. Some people go a third, 2/3, either way. I do about 50-50 and take that existing Calgary soil and mix it with your compost or your potting soil. That way the roots are starting to get used to that heavier soil as they grow. And when they hit our regular soil, they're more than prepared to get into it. They might have to toughen up a bit, but they'll get there. So that's how you want to plant it. And again, sounds like I'm beating a dead horse. As you backfill, and I see this happen, you measure on, it looks good, you backfill, but now your soil level is up to there. Lift it out the hole, put in a bit of soil, damp it down, put it back in, backfill again. You're already there, you're already dirty, you already have everything out and you're planting. Better to spend that 2 minutes there and run the risk of killing your perennial. It's that easy. And trust me, years of experience. I always take my shovel, I measure it against my pot, and I go, okay, I want to go to about that depth. I put it in. It's not an exact science. I'm never going to get it right. There's always going to be slight deviations. Years and years of doing this, I'm pretty good at getting it. I've still made mistakes. Last year, guaranteed when I was doing some plantings, guaranteed I was like, too deep, too shallow, and I had to adjust it. So I recommend doing that while you've got everything out, and then water heavily. You really want to make sure that we establish that moisture. It's going to make sure that the roots and the soil mix well together, pull out any air pockets, make sure it doesn't sink. So you really want to give it a good watering. So where do we plant our perennials? You want to make sure they go in the correct exposure. People come to me and they go, oh, I love echinacea, but my yard is full shade. Okay, well, you're going to have to love it from afar. We can't change what happens there. Certain plants will do okay. I have seen hostas growing in full sun, but a lot of times they dry out really quick. They don't look wonderful. The leaves are sagging. They start getting crispy. So when you look at a tag, and any of the tags should tell you, I wanted to pull the tag out, but I guess I'm moving the whole plant, the sun exposure right on the top. So always look at that. And I mean, you can try and cheat it for sure if you're like, oh, I think I've got enough. If it's not doing great, you can always move it. But if it's like this plant needs full sun and you put it in full shade, it doesn't matter how much fertilizer or water or good soil you give it, it is not going to grow. So always plant to your exposure and plant according to mature height and spread. So a lot of times people will come and they'll buy some plants and they'll look at them and they'll go, oh, great, you know what? I've got this delphinium and I got a bleeding heart. Oh, the bleeding heart is bigger than the delphinium, so that's where they'll plant them. Then in about 2 years, when the delphinium is this big and bushy and they can't really see the bleeding heart, they've got to start transplanting things. So again, it's not letting me rip out any labels. I'm going to start, way to go, bleeding heart, you're my friend. Look on the tags, and it should tell you also the height and the spread of them. So you always want to make sure when you're doing it, you're planning out accordingly. I mean, people change it up, and absolutely you can. There's always perspective. Maybe you're building it for somebody who's housebound, so they're going to look at it from a window and look down. So you adjust it accordingly. Maybe they've got a favorite, you want something over there, or you're playing to a tree trunk or a fence. But the ideal rule of thumb is big in the back, small in the front. So it tears down, so when the sun's hitting it, they're not shading each other out, and aesthetically, so that we can enjoy it. We're putting these in because we love plants, we love flowers. You plant them, you know, here's another great example. So that is bigger than the hosta. You put them in, the hosta is soon going to overshadow that. You won't even enjoy it, and the leaf gets too big, it may actually shade it out completely. So always check tags, labels, and plant according to that. Again, we can't change that. People ask, well, can I prune it? Can I cut it? Yep, but you might cut off flower buds. So if you plant accordingly and find the correct plants, you can make it work. For new plantings, plant according to the weather. Don't plant when it's plus 40. Don't plant if there's going to be heavy snowfall or heavy frost the next day. You really want to baby them, get them in the ground, give them a really good first season so they establish, gives them a better chance of coming back the next years. Consider your bloom times. I'll see people who they get excited and they blast all their perennials in one spot and everything blooms at once and then everything's finished, and then in the spring and in the fall it's just green and there's nothing else happening. Spread them out, have bands of color. So something's happening here and here, then when they die down, something's coming up here. So you want to play for the bloom time as well. That's really important. And then be aware of the factors. I'm talking about how they play with each other, but look at other things as well. People think this looks beautiful, it's nice and small, so they put it next to a pathway. Well, then eventually when it spreads out like this, you can't walk down the path without constantly hitting your plant. You're going to start breaking leaves. You're going to start disturbing it. Now, instead of energy going into the roots to come back for next year, it's trying to repair itself, so you're constantly weakening it. So always just kind of look around, have a look if there's an immature tree and you've planted, how big is that tree going to be in 6 years? Is the canopy going to get huge and shade out all of your sun lovers? So keep an eye on all of those factors when you do it. And honestly, you can always bring photographs in, breed tags, use our plant finder from our website, tons of different resources, talk to people, whatever it takes, and get a feel for what you want. And like I said in the second one, we're going to talk about transplanting, because we've all made mistakes, myself included, where we've gone, that didn't go. Or a plant has exceeded or not lived up to the standards on the tag, so now the garden is out of whack. But that's going to be Perennials Part 2. I need a cooler name than that. Perennials, the regrowing. And then, again, not a comprehensive list, far from it, but I try to pick ones that we could all recognize, ones that had different colors happening. And you can see a list there of plants that do really good in the spring, the summer, and the autumn. So that's what I often get asked is people go, well, I prefer annuals. They bloom all year round. Yeah, absolutely they do. That's literally what they're designed to do. We deadhead them. They send out more flowers. The reason for that, if the plant knows it's not one season. I've got one season here. So we take off, and we'll talk about deadheading soon, but we take off that seed pod, needs to put out another one. Can't get a seed pod without a flower, and presto, we get flowers. Perennials are very different. Their flowers are done, no problem, they'll just grow. So they don't have that. Now, some may put out some extra blooms. I've seen it happen with Columbine, but it's never as prolific as the first set. And it depends on a number of things, conditions, factors, weather factors, and all of that. But you can see, just from a quick list like that, there are 18 perennials that'll give you blooms throughout an entire season. And you don't have to do one. You don't have to put in just one bleeding heart. You can put in 3. There's white bleeding hearts, and there's miniature bleeding hearts, and cutleaf bleeding hearts. So you can play bleeding hearts against each other. So there's something happening even amongst those. And then as they're finishing, always a fan favorite, the peony, that's going to start coming up. It's going to match the color, but the leaf is somewhat different. So you can do a lot, just even with those 18. And like I said, there's considerably more. And then the great thing, you've got the foliage to play with as well. So there's always fun things happening with foliage. I love this one too. I'm going to give the euphorbia a shout out. Just because it looks like somebody literally came along and spray painted the very top of it.
It's so cool.
I know. It's one of my all-time favorites. Just literally looks like somebody came out and went psh, 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 and spray painted them all yellow. I love it. It always makes me happy. That one's a great spring bloomer. We see it a lot. Brandy was saying the common name is cushy or cushion or it's spurge. I'm just totally throwing you under the bus. And there's a list. So again, what you have to consider, we talk about the seasons, but what we talked about earlier was the exposure. So we put a list here of sun-loving and shade-loving perennials. So you really have to look at that because, for example, my backyard, my front yard is just all sun all the time. But my backyard is very, very, very split. There are areas that get no sunlight whatsoever. Maybe, I shouldn't say whatsoever, maybe an hour in the morning, 2 hours in the morning. I don't count that as anything. And then it's full shade. But then there's parts in my backyard that are full sun, and then there's that transitional part. So you have to know what is sun, what is shade, what's going to go in, what's going to bloom in the spring. You know, sometimes people go away in the summer, and I've done gardens like this where people are like, I don't care about summer blooms. I'm never home. Can we fill it very heavy spring, very heavy autumn? Of course, we can do whatever. If that's how you enjoy it, we can cater to that. It's not that hard. Again, this is for you, what you want to enjoy. So build the perennials accordingly. And then, next page. So the next page again is just shade-loving ones. A lot of times, one thing you may notice is when you're looking at the perennials, a lot of shade perennials also tend to be spring blooming perennials. And one reason for that is a lot of the shade perennials, where they naturalized, where we got them from and then hybridized them and whatnot, were in forests. So they need to blast out that flower early before the tree canopy comes in, and they're not going to have the energy to get it out. So that's why they've adapted. So you might see Lily of the Valley, Woodruff, Solomon Seal. They're amazing. They're all going to roughly bloom at the same time. And that's the reason for that, is because they're fighting against, a canopy. Not much you can do to cheat that. But again, we're going to baby them. We're going to make sure they've got the correct water and fertilizer, and they got everything they needed the prior year. So the blooms will last a lot longer. They're not going to drop them immediately, and we can coax them through. But even there, right on the list, goat's beard and hosta bloom much later in the season. So there's always plants going to be going throughout the season. Now, deadheading. It's one of those things, people often have heard the term, but they're not entirely sure what it is. They're also not entirely sure why. People have told them to do it, they don't get it. And the reason for it, and I'm just going to say this, I'm actually a fan of the Grateful Dead, if my hair didn't give that away. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not a hippie, but I actually do like the Grateful Dead, but I love saying deadheading, not hippie related. It makes me laugh. So that's a personal joke. If you laugh, you have a great sense of humor. If you didn't, you also have a great sense of humor. Don't insult your audience. So all that means, and we don't have any because it's springtime, actually maybe one of the columbines. Oh, yes, perfect. So that's the bloom, and that little crown looking thing, that's the seed pod. Okay, so what happens is deadheading, like we said earlier, it blooms, it's an early spring bloomer. Pollinators love it. So the pollinators, they're hungry, they just woke up. So they fly to it, pollinate it, hey presto, the flower dies. There's one way you can still see the remnants of the flower dying in the seed pod. And now that seed pod has emerged and we don't have a flower. So nothing's going to happen. All that's going to happen is as those seeds grow, that seed pod is going to get fatter till it matures. It's going to split and it's going to drop the seeds. That's literally how nature designs them. So what we want to do is we want to remove that. And the reason we're removing it is it requires a lot of energy for the plant to grow that seed. So the perennial doesn't really care if it lives year after year. It has no knowledge of that. It is simply trying to propagate the species. That's all it's doing. That's how it's evolved after millennia. That's nature's way. So it doesn't really care. So it's taking all of the energy. It's getting blasted now by the sun. It's having a great time. Photosynthesis is popping. I mean, look at all of those leaves. They're all nice and green. It loves the full sun. So it's just soaking up that energy and it's pushing it all to the seeds. And those seeds develop. Well, what we do is we come along and we remove the seed pod. Now, it's not an annual, so it's not going to send out more flowers. So what it does instead is it goes, oh no, I can't grow a seed. I need to make sure I propagate. So it pulls all of that energy down into the roots, puts out more vegetative growth. The reason for that is next year, it's going to come back bigger, stronger, with more blooms, so it can have more seeds. Little does it know, we're going to do the same thing to it next year, sucker. And every year, we're going to send that energy back into the plant. And that's how they get bigger and stronger. And that's why when you see an immature or a young perennial compared to one that might have been growing for 10 years, the height difference and the bloom difference, because it's constantly absorbing that energy and using it to force out the growth because it needs to propagate. So that's basically why we do it. And then the third one, and this is throwing back to, my landscaping days where I did a lot of ornamental horticulture. It just looks nicer. It looks tidier, cleaning out the stems, the old flowers hanging off, to get out there and do some quick deadheading, prune, break off, whatever you need to do. It just gives the garden the tidy, cared for, looked after aesthetic, and it gives health to the plants. So it's kind of a win-win as you go. So how to deadhead, and I have seen this more times than I care to admit, and I've done it once, and it wasn't great. So again, wow, this guy is coming in real handy. So we have a flower, very easy to recognize. We have a seed pod, now that I've pointed it out, but right here and right here, we have flower buds, okay? So I have seen people before where I've said to them, go deadhead the columbine. And it's funny because this is the plant I did, not this one specifically, but this is the type of plant I did it on. So I was as green as this leaf, no experience. The guy who was teaching me, we'd gone over a bunch of stuff. He'd explained everything to me. He was an amazing guy, well, he still is, amazing gardener. And he said, okay, go deadhead the columbine. I said, hey, no problem. And I went and I took it and I snipped all stems. I took every single flower bud off a mature columbine. The client was not super happy with me. It wasn't an awesome moment in my career. I learned pretty quick to not do that again. So when you see something like this, if you're not sure, if you're like, I don't know, I know that's a seed pod, but I don't know what that is, just break off the individual seed pod. I don't have snips, so I'm not going to do it because I don't want to damage it. Cut the seed pod off. When everything's finished, then you can cut the entire stalk down. The other one, I've never done this. I made that mistake once. I felt so bad. I mean, it did wonders for the plant because the plant didn't even spend energy blooming. So think how much energy it had the next year. I was being proactive, but nobody else saw it that way. But yeah, daylilies. The flower bud and the seed pod can look very, very similar. A couple of years ago, I was deadheading with somebody, just not a commercial, and I turned around and they were breaking off live heads. And I'm like, oh, be careful. And I showed them the distinct differences, no problem moving forward. So it's going to happen. The one benefit is you won't hurt the plant. And I made a joke there. I wasn't being proactive. I made a mistake, but it was proactive. That plant will reabsorb all of that energy. It requires energy to bloom, but we like the flowers. We don't like the seeds. That's why we pick and choose what we do. And like I said at the beginning, it's why I live head my hostas. Some people love the flowers, and again, to each their own, but you've got this amazing foliage and then this alien looking thing with these pale violet flowers. It's not my cup of tea, so they're coming off. I love the foliage. So that's how and why we deadhead and what deadheading is. Oh my God, I said there was a lot of ground to cover. We got a few more slides. We'll get through them quick. I promise. I just looked at I don't need a timer. I've got my watch. How did that work out? So watering requirements for new plantings every day for the first 2 weeks. Again, we have to baby them. We have to let them establish. And you really, really want to saturate that soil. A quick spray like that when it's a 20, 25 degree day is not enough. You want to puddle on the surface around it. It'll drain most of the soil here. It'll hold the moisture, but it allows very good drainage. So you'll be fine. But remember what I said about giving the plant some adversity. Let it tell you when it needs water. So great example. This is one of the reasons why I grabbed this one. I grabbed it before they finished watering. So you can see that soil is dry and you can see those leaves are starting to wilt, okay? And I grabbed that deliberately. That is now telling me there is no damage happening to that plant. Wilt is a protective matter. What the plant is doing, it's losing moisture, so the cell wall is shrinking, so it doesn't have the rigidity to hold up. But that's also a spiral mechanism, because what it's doing now is it's lowering its surface. It's curling in and it's drooping down. And it's not allowing the photosynthesis to happen. Photosynthesis requires water. The less amount of photosynthesis, the less amount of water required. So it's a survival technique. The moment after the seminar, we're going to get the, you know what? I'm willing to share. I'm a nice guy. You're welcome. And that's going to bounce. We may even see those leaves lift in a few minutes. Probably not, because I looked at the time again. When they're blooming, they are probably going to need more water. Again, they require more energy. A plant gets its food and its energy from light. So it needs to photosynthesize. It's really firing, like those chloroplasts, bam, 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 all cylinders. So you may notice it drying up, especially your summer bloomers, when we've got 30 or 35 degree days. You may be watering your perennial garden a couple of times. A soaker hose, weave through them all on a timer, can also be a great way to do it. But keep an eye on that. Any transplanted or divided perennials, treat them as new perennials. So make sure they've got the water they need. And a common mistake people make is at the end of the season, when it's going dormant, the leaves are going brown, there's some green, they're like, it's done. Water it. There is still, if there's green, there's still something happening. Water what? Most you're going to do is waste a little bit of water. You're not going to hurt the plant by doing that. Okay, real quick, how fast can I get through fertilizing? I was going to go really fast then. I'm like, no, okay, stay on target. So fertilizing, it's going to help your new plants establish quicker, especially if you use a root booster. Okay, and what that's going to do, exactly, the clue is in the name. The plant's going to absorb it, and that one is specifically designed to help those roots grow. If the roots are growing underground, they can pull up more nutrition and water, which is going to force more leaves out. So that is really important. And again, you want to use this on divided or transplanted, okay? Because when you've divided a plant, you've cut the root ball in half. When you've transplanted it, unless you're lifting out a clod of earth like this, you've probably torn or damaged roots. So you want those roots to pick up real quick. All-purpose fertilizer, we have organics, we got a shake and feed, whatever you want to use. All-purpose is great because a perennial needs all of its part. It needs the leaves for the energy. It needs the roots to get that energy and to bring it back the next year, and it's going to flower. It needs to flower for the seeds. We need it to flower for our enjoyment. So a really good all-purpose is ideal for perennials. It's going to make sure the plant stays healthy. And I find a lot of people, they'll fertilize, but they don't start a fertilizer program. So in the spring, they're like, oh yeah, I'll give it some fertilizer. Mid-season, they've tapered off. Keep it going. The rain will dilute it. Us watering will dilute it. The plant will gobble it up. Some will wash away and never be used. And like I said, this is trying to store energy to come back for next year. So if I had to pick between fertilizing my annuals and fertilizing my perennials, perennials every time would win. I do both, but if I had to pick, every single time it's going to be my perennials. They need it a lot more than the annuals. No matter what I do, that annual is dead at the end of the season. Everything I do, I can keep this alive for decades. I can divide them and give them as gifts to people in houses. So really do that. And then I mention this every time we talk about fertilizers, follow manufacturers' recommendations. If they say 10 milliliters to a liter, do that. 20 milliliters to a liter is not better. If your doctor tells you take 1 penicillin a day, you don't go, well, 2's obviously better. You take 1. It's the same kind of idea. Too much can cause fertilizer burn. The salts and the minerals in the fertilizer can clog the roots. Now it can't uptake water and whatnot properly. You can do more damage than good. These guys have worked on this. They've got R&D departments. They've gone to school for it. Every fertilizer is going to have full instructions on the bottle. I'm not going to read them out because they're all different. Make sure you read it, follow it. If you don't understand it, if you're like, I don't get this one, ask one of us and we'll walk you through it. So, and last but not least, some tips and tricks. I do not advise to put perennials, I get asked every year, in planters, containers, raised beds. And the reason for that is they like to be in the ground. They like their roots insulated by the ground. In a raised planter, the wind and the frost and everything else, all of that is hitting it and it is freezing it hard and the root tips burn. Next spring, it doesn't have the tips to get going. it often dies out. I hear it a lot. Oh, I tried a perennial in a container. It didn't come back. That's the reason why. Mulching a perennial is hugely beneficial. I never mulch my annuals. I do mulch perennials. It helps with moisture retention, keeps the soil at an even temperature, stops weeds from popping up because the weeds will pinch the nutrients from them. Perennials play well with others. And that's what we need to remember. You don't have to have a perennial bed. You can do perennials and put sunflowers in the back. You can have your shade perennials and you go, oh, well, they're all going to bloom in the spring, so put impatiens and begonias amongst them. So you can play very well. You can put perennials with tomatoes, with peppers. They'll bring in pollinators. Everything will help. Perennials, and again, follow the size on the tag. They play really well with other plants. Always amend your perennial bed, but when you do it, be careful of the roots. If you put in a cultivator and you can't get it in because there's roots there, leave the amendments on the top. Allow watering and rain to leach them into the soil. It is not beneficial to rip the roots to get amendments in. The amendments are not going to bring those roots back. You're going to hurt your perennial. Where's my delphinium? There it is. Place stakes or cages early in the spring. Too many times I see people's peonies like this, and the flower starts opening and it starts bending. Now they're trying to put a cage on it and it's breaking, or they're knocking all the petals off and they're doing damage. If you know you've got a plant that needs to be staked, get the stake on it right away. As it grows, you can just put some ties on it. You're not going to disturb anything. So always make sure you do that. I always see people doing it too late in the season. I've also been guilty on times when I've forgotten. Do what you like, it's your garden. You just like springtime. You're gone in the summer and you're not an autumn person. Plant only spring blooms. Do what makes you happy. Too many times I hear people go, oh, well, I'm not sure about my neighbors. Unless they're paying your mortgage or your rent, they really have no say. It's your garden. I want to see you at the end of the day. We're living in crazy times right now. Everybody is busy. I want to see you at the end of the day pull up to your garden with a smile on your face. If your neighbor pulls up and they're sulking, sounds like a them problem, not a you problem. And ask for help, okay? I know for a fact some people come in and they don't really know what they're doing, or they're not sure what works, or they don't want to bug us because staff might be watering. I've even had somebody say, oh, I know how busy you are. I didn't want to stop you. Stop me, literally. There is nothing I am doing that is more important than helping a customer and helping a gardener. So even if you see me pounce on me and be like, hey, can you help me? The answer is yes. Even if I've got a 911, I will come back to you, or I will get you somebody else. We're not going to leave you hanging. It's literally why we're here. Massive thank you for bearing with me through that. Sorry it went a little over. So no Q&A. Just kidding.
Oh my God, you gave me a heart attack.
Should have seen the luck I got.
Don't do that.
Oh my gosh.
We have some really good questions.
Yeah, well, we got time for them too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you. Without everybody being there and listening, it would be me yelling at Brandy and the camera and some poor Columbine. So I very much appreciate it. I'm going to have a sip of water and let's kick off with Q&A.